Hello, friends. Does authority in worship really matter? Hope and pray you'll stay tuned because today on The Logical Truth, we're going to be giving an answer to that, so just stay right there. Hello, friends, and welcome to The Logical Truth. My name is Wes Garland, and I am the pulpit minister here for the Central Church of Christ here in Saraland, Alabama, and I'm just so very delighted to have you join me today as we start this series of studies. We're starting a series that I've entitled Understanding Worship, and today, my friends, we're basically looking at the authority for worship. And whenever you think about authority, it's so very important that we understand what we're talking about. When I mention the word authority, we're talking about the governing factor. We're talking about the standard by which the worship actually comes from or is based upon. And simply asking the question, does the authority in worship really matter? And so whenever we get into this, I think it's very important for us to understand that in every period of biblical history, we've always had people who thought that they could approach God in any fashion and that He would accept it. I mean, we think about in Genesis chapter 4 and talking about Cain. We're talking about Leviticus chapter 10 whenever we're talking about Nadab and Abihu. What about King Saul there in 1 Samuel chapter 13? And then the Athenians over here in Acts chapter 17. In every dispensation, we have individuals who were just casting up to God what they thought they could offer unto God and that God would accept it. But we also see that there are some problems and consequences with that type of thinking. Well, if you think about each account, in Genesis chapter 4, we see very clearly that God did not respect Cain's offering. We see over here in Leviticus chapter 10 that profane fire was offered to God, which He had not commanded them, and by consequence, we see that Nadab and Abihu were burnt to death by God. We see over here that in 1 Samuel chapter 13, that you have not kept the commandment of the Lord. That's what Samuel said in relationship to King Saul. You also see over here in Acts chapter 17, the phrase, whom you worship without knowing, does not dwell in temples made with hands. See, they did not even know who in the world they were even worshiping, and because of that, they were not being accepted unto God. The fact of the matter is, my friends, that God has always had a part in the worship of Himself. And He is the one who gives the orders and the requirements that make it accepted. Because in all reality, I want you to think about it this way. If it is the case that it is God Himself that we are worshiping, don't you think it would be wise for us to then look unto God and say, God, what would you have for me to do? If I'm worshiping you, I want to please you. I mean, I'm not going to please myself. I want to please you, God. Don't you think it would be important to go ahead and ask God, what do you have to say about the matter? My friends, it's so vitally important that we understand this point. Because if we're talking about the authority in worship, and God has always, as what we've already stated right here, had requirements and has always made mention of what He wants in His worship, then friends, we have to understand too that if it's not according to that standard, God's not going to accept it, just as He did not accept nor respect Cain's worship. So let's get on into this. In every dispensation, we've seen this, and we even see this being the case even in the Old Testament. Now, if you were to look in the Old Testament and ask God, God, do you have any ability, or have you spoken to your own creation as to say who it is that's going to be in your presence? Have you ever done that? Well, absolutely He has. Look over here with me in Psalm 15, verses 1 through 5. He says, Lord, who may abide in your temple or your tabernacle, and who may dwell in your holy hill? He who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors those who fear the Lord. He who swears in his own hurt and does not change. He who does not put out his money at usury, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved. See, simply asking the question, God, who is it that's going to be dwelling in your tabernacle? Who's going to be dwelling on your holy hill? Who's going to be in your presence to be accepted by you? And well, you see very clearly through these verses that the way that a person walks among himself, the way that he acts, the things that he does in relationship to people, the way that he loves God, those who fear God, those are the ones that's going to be able to approach God in any fashion and be accepted. See, my friends, it's so very important that whenever you're talking here about worship to God, if we want to become into being in His presence, we've got to come according to His rules, His regulations. Because if we're not, it will never be accepted. It doesn't matter what we may want it to be the case. It may be that we may want something to be the situation of where I can do it my way and God will still accept it. It doesn't matter. God has His way, and He's communicated that down to man. He's always made mention that if you're going to worship me, you're going to come to me on my rules, on my standard. You know, we even see this over here in Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse number 4. As He's given these orders, He says, you shall not worship the Lord your God with such things. Talk about idolatry and things of that nature. He says, I'm going to make a stipulation right here. I don't like it, I don't want it, and I will not accept it. You shall not worship the Lord your God with such things. I'm not going to do it. So if you see that in the Old Testament, and we understand from Galatians chapter 3 that the Old Testament was actually a tutor, a guide, a teacher to lead us to Christ, do you think, let me ask you this honestly, if God absolutely didn't accept it in the Old Testament, do you think somehow, some way, He's all of a sudden going to accept it in the New? My friends, understand, God doesn't change. And He tells us that we ourselves cannot worship God in any way that we want to do. Now watch this. In 2 Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 25, we see a particular phrase being used here, and I think it's going to be very prevalent for us to study this. Watch what he says here. And he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, with stringed instruments, and with harps, according to the commandment of David, of Gad the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet. For thus was the commandment of the Lord by His prophets. See, the way that they stationed the Levites into the house of the Lord, they did it according to the commandment of David, which, by the way, the commandment of David is another way of saying from the commandment of the Lord, because at the very end of this verse, you actually see this. For thus was the commandment of the Lord by His prophets. The people of God stationed themselves exactly the way God had commanded. Why? Why? Why would they even think about this? Because that's the way that they wanted to do it. They were more concerned about God Himself and worshiping Him in an acceptable way, therefore they did it according to His standard. Now let me ask you, do we have the same type of heart today? Do we long to look at God and say, God, I want to do this your way so that I can stand right in your sight? Because if we're not really interested in this, then, my friends, we might as well just hang it up. You know, there's a word that's going to be used in the New Testament, and we're going to see that here in just a second. And that is the word vain. Whenever He says, in vain you do worship me. Friends, understand the possibility of that it is possible that we can actually stand before God. We can attempt to worship Him. We can attempt to give Him all the honor, glory, and praise that we want to give Him, and it still be in vain. We can call it worship all we want, but the fact is, God is only going to accept that which is according to His standard. That's a very, very key point to be understood. But you know what? Not only do we see this in the Old Testament, but remember how I said that in every dispensation we see that God has always made a place in making ordinances and stipulations as to how He wants us to worship Him. And we see this even also in the New Testament. Now, going to that passage that we were just talking about there in Matthew chapter 15, we see this very clear right here. Watch what He says right here, beginning of verse number 6. Then he need not honor his father or mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Hypocrites! Well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Now I want you to focus on a few things. What they had simply done is that they were putting the traditions of the elders above the tradition of God or the commandment of God. And when they are doing this, I want you to look back at the screen and look at this. He says, thus, in verse number 6, thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect or of no power or of no thought by your tradition. And notice what else he says. He says, these people, verse number 8, these people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips. See, they're trying to cast all this honor and praise that they desire upon to God. He says, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. See, the standard for every single bit of their worship right here was based upon the traditions of men. Basically, what did the elders say? What did the people say? What did our authorities say? Rather than looking at what God had to say about it. See, Jesus brought it very, very clear the point that this is what God stated. You'll have to read a little bit further back into the account right here. But he says, God said this, but you say this. See, every single bit of our worship to God and anything we do in the religious sense, we all have to make a decision. Do we want to listen to man more, or do we want to listen to God? Which one is of more importance? Because which one you ever see is of more importance will be the source by which everything guides itself. See, the fact is, if God says one thing and all of a sudden somebody else says something that differs from this, we have that choice to make who we're going to listen to. And when it comes to our worship, it's no different. We have to listen to God, my friends, if we want to be pleasing to God, or we can listen to man and it not be accepted. Therefore, it's in vain, basically saying with emptiness, you're pouring out so much effort trying to appeal unto me, but guess what? I'm not going to accept it. Why? Because the standard is different. See, we even see this in another place over here in John chapter 4, verses 23 and 24. Remember how he says here, but the hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. He says, for the Father is seeking such to worship Him. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. See, as we see right here, there's some phrases that we need to look at. Number one, true worshipers. That simply implies that there are a lot of worshipers that are out here, but there are just some that are known as true worshipers. Those who are truly worshiping God according to His standard, trying to appeal unto God upon what He says. And He says that the Father is seeking such to worship Him. Do we understand what that really means? God is seeking after those individuals who are going to look to Him. Not look to man, not look to his friends and his family, not looking about what his thoughts and his emotions really desire. The first and foremost thing that comes through a person's mind who is a true worshiper of God is, I must be concerned about what God has to say about it. Now ask yourself this question. Is that the way that we worship God today? Is that the way that you worship God today? That God is the first and foremost thing in your heart, in your mind? Being willing to put aside all the desires of our flesh, what we like, what we don't like. Because in all reality, friends, it's not about us. Because we're not worshiping us. Who are we worshiping? We're supposed to be worshiping God. And we've got to come to Him on His standard. My friend, let's see some facts here. Whenever you stop and consider some of the facts of what we've already been discussing, we see very clearly that God Himself has never accepted anything that man wants to offer to God. See, the fact is, I don't know where this mentality comes from. I really do think it's pride and arrogance, where man himself actually thinks, hey, you know what? I can give to God whatever I want to give to God. And God's a loving God, and therefore people think that because God is loving, He'll never condemn anything or reject anything. Well, we've already seen that's not the case. The fact is, a loving God is seeking the person to love Him back. According to 1 John chapter 2, he says, for we know that we know Him if we do what? Keep His commandments. See, even John chapter 14, verse 15, that simply says, if you love me, what are you going to do? Keep my commandments. So whenever you think about it from that perspective, God is seeking those individuals to love Him back. God is a very loving God. Amen about that. But the fact of the matter is, God only accepts those who are willing to love Him back. And if we're going to love Him back, my friends, we're going to give Him what He desires, not just anything we want to throw up at Him. Another fact that we can actually see is this. God only accepts that which is in accordance to His will, orders, and statutes. See, the fact is, if He only accepts those things, then what does that actually do to the rest of everything? Well, it throws the rest of it out. All those things that are against God's will, against what He absolutely desires, because I want to ask you something. And I know I've asked this in previous episodes, but I think it's a very key point to understand with this. Do you think that we serve an all-powerful God? Yes. Do you really believe that He's an all-knowing God? Yes. If that be the case, if He's all-powerful, do you think He has the ability to communicate unto His own creation the things that He desires? Absolutely. Do you think that He has the ability to communicate it in a way that His own creation can understand it? Absolutely. Well, if that be the case, and it is, then friends, He has given to us what He desires. All that it takes from us is to read it, understand it, and respect it. Now, if you're willing to do that, and if you respect what He has to say, then you're going to then follow that up with doing exactly what He's asked for us to do. And when we do that, guess what happens? God then accepts everything that we are offering. It's no longer a lost battle. It's not something of just a waste of energy. He's actually going to accept it. And that's what needs to be in the forefront of our minds. We also see another fact, that just because man may want to worship God and approach God, they must come to Him on His terms, His orders, and His statutes. See, just because man may want to worship God and approach God, guess what? It doesn't mean he's going to be accepted. I mean, you think about this. As much as I may want to tour a facility or maybe tour a house that I really, really love, I'm never going to be able to gain access into that house unless the owner of the house allows me to come in. Because guess what? If I force my way in, what is that called? Breaking and entering. It's also called trespassing. If we don't even accept that in the physical world today, Why do we think that just because we may want to be in God's presence, just because we may want to worship God in an acceptable way, that God's going to accept it? My friends, remember who we are worshiping. We're worshiping God. We're not worshiping ourselves. We don't make the rules. He makes the rules. And with that being the case, we've got to come to God on His terms and not on ours. We also see another fact. The desire is something that is absolutely crucial in our worship to God, but our desire is not all that is important. See, the desire has to be there. Because remember what we just said over here in John chapter 4 in verse number 24? You remember what we said right here? But the hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship Him. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth. See, what's so very key with this passage right here is this. If we're going to come to God on His terms and according to His ordinance, the desire has to be there. Because I want you to think about this. I don't think it's a coincidence that John chapter 4, verse 24 starts with this, that God is spirit. And then He corresponds a certain thing in relationship to us, that those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. Our connection of spirit must be there. He is a spiritual being, we are a spiritual being, and therefore our spiritual being must be in correspondence to God's spiritual nature. And when you have the subject that is living right, who is doing right, and is in a right relationship with God, then when a person worships according to truth, which means according to His standard, according to the way that He has stated, then friends, guess what we're then going to be called? We're going to be called the true worshipers of God, the one whom God is actually seeking after. So it's a very beautiful, beautiful thing for us to remember. But how do we know all this? We know this by number one, the word must in John 4 and verse 24 shows that we are obligated to God's will and God's way if we want to offer to Him that which He accepts. The word must is obligatory. It's not something of a suggestion. It's not something of saying, well, hey, I'm going to give you a certain thought that you need to be thinking about. No. Whenever God says that if you're going to come to worship me, you must worship me in spirit and in truth, there is no discussion about it, my friends. There's no discussion, there's no thought, there's nothing of that nature. He simply states that if you're going to come to Him on His terms, you're going to have to do this. And that's what we need to be focusing on for ourselves as well. But we also see this as well with using the word vain in Matthew chapter 15 and verse number 9. That shows to us that when it is not according to God's will and way, that we are doing it in pointlessness. My friends, do we realize that? Do we realize that using the word must in John 4 verse 24 and the word vain in Matthew 15 verse 9 says that there is a way that we can be accepted to God, but there's also a way in which we cannot be accepted by God. So then who actually chooses? We choose that. God doesn't force you to do it in a right way. He's not going to force you to do it in the wrong way. It all comes down to you and me having the desire enough to say, God, I desire you more than myself. And whenever I come to worship you, it's going to be what you want and not what I want. The authority for the worship absolutely matters, my friends. And my prayer to you is that you will take this to heart. Evaluate everything that you've been doing in your life. Whenever you go to worship, evaluate why you're there. And upon what standard are we actually there? So with that being the case, Hope and pray that today's study has been very beneficial to you. I hope and pray that you've learned a lot. If we can help you in any way, please reach out to me. You can either email me, you can call me. You do whatever you can to reach me, and I'll be more than happy to help you in your journey to heaven. But until next time, may God richly bless you. Know that I love you. Have a great day.